Survivors said the graves were there for years, even decades.
My stepfather was here, and he talked about, as a young man, that they dug graves here.
Of all the horrible things that happened at residential schools, why was this the most shocking? Maybe Canada just wasn't ready to believe them. That all changed a year ago this May.
The remains of 215 children were found at a former residential school in British Columbia.
The Kamloops Indian Residential School was first established in 1890, and thousands of kids from across BC were sent here.
As more First Nations conducted searches of their former schools, more graves were found. And a terrible reckoning began. While some survivors felt vindicated, some, like Mike Kakagi, began to see that the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, also called IRSA, needed a second look, and maybe even needed to be reopened. The longtime survivors advocate works with retired Algoma University professor Edward Sadowski, researching old records in the National Archives. And what they found surprised them.
Because of the situation and what we found in this research, and it involved a lot more, it was a little bit bigger and larger than we thought. Okay, what we've been doing with it is sending this out to different interested groups across the country. We've sent some out to the people out in Western Canada, the people in Thunder Bay, the Haudenosaunee people, and up in Northern Quebec. They're all aware of what we found, and one person in particular there, he was very adamant that we reopen the settlement agreement.
2 months after the graves at Kamloops were found, Kakagi and Sadowski circulated a report on their research. The next phase, it appears, in this shameful national saga, will be all about records. And Kakagi says the Indian Affairs Archives, referred to as RG-10 files, reveal clues to other problems related to residential schools.
If they really started, this thing really started to roll, Paul, there'd be a lot of implications, a lot of ramifications. It would ripple across Canada. The whole legal world would shake, because of what happened in here.
The report raises a number of issues. The Common Experience Payment, or CEP, was paid to anyone who could prove they attended a residential school. They received $10,000 for their first year and $3,000 for any additional years in the schools. And according to the government's own numbers, close to 1/4 of applicants, almost 24,000 people, were rejected, usually because the records that could confirm their time in school were not available. That led to a $329 million surplus, money that was not shared amongst survivors. That's about 1/6 of the total $1.9 billion that was set aside for compensation.
What happened with the church withholding records, and how much of that $1.9 billion would have been dispersed if the records had been available. Every time we look at one of these facts, there's it all reverts back to the withholding and the lack of availability of proper records for the survivors.
Even more shocking, the researchers found that treaty annuities for the children were often paid to the school, not the student. Kakagi said that meant the survivors were subsidizing their own time in the schools.
If you look back at it, it was probably used to bury some of the children too, those funds.
He says that money belonged to the students.
When the treaties were completed, they were deemed sacred, and that means the terms and conditions contained in that treaty were sacred. And in the treaty, it's very, very specific that they're to pay everyone that's beneficiary of the treaty an annuity of $4 to $5 or whatever else to the beneficiaries, which were the children. Now, for the government to take it upon themselves and do that, that's a serious, serious violation of our treaty relationship. Never mentioned again in the settlement agreement.
Kakagi says the settlement agreement should be reopened to address old developments and new.
So it was a sweetheart deal for lawyers. And that's what it basically was. And the victims, again, were the Residential School Survivor Society, or the residential school survivors. And and anyone that's knowledgeable and has taken the time to look back at the settlement agreement, they can understand that. And a lot of them were really, really concerned and wanted to go ahead and see if we could reopen it. But when you start looking back and you can see all the feelings of the settlement agreement, it basically reinforces what we said from day one. We as the survivors, our organization, the National Indian Residential School Survivor Society, when they signed that off in Ottawa, we went down trying to get it stopped because we weren't happy with it, because it had no reflection at all on what we was told to us and what we thought the way it was going to be crafted.
Kakagi says Canada's role as administrator for the settlement agreement led to serious conflicts of interest.
When an issue became critical, that there was a strong possibility that was going to cost Canada large sums of money, while they were administering the settlement agreement, they had the ability to hijack and curtail or put restrictions on certain areas of discussion and topics. If something became too hot for them, they had their own way of shutting it down. Okay, and again, by them controlling it, there was restrictions put on what we could discuss and how we could, and one of them was the missing graves.
Found buried in the report is this: the Justice Ministry has records that could locate lost and missing children, including those who died in the schools.
Have you found in your research, you and Ed, that the Justice Department is preventing access to information that would help fill in some of the blanks?
Oh, big time. We want to get the pay list. You see, if we can get the pay list for the treaty monies, it would give us the names of a lot of those children that were buried there. But they refused to do that under the Privacy Act. Okay? But on the same venue, they used our G10 files to identify a lot of our survivors so they could get paid. So on one hand, they're saying it's a violation of privacy, yet on the other hand, they're accepting them. And that's what they do. So this whole settlement agreement, it says it's Indian or INAC, okay, or Indigenous Affairs Canada that it had. It's part of the Justice were the ones that really administered and set the terms and conditions and the parameters in which the settlement agreement functioned and what was paid out and how it was paid out, and they made all the decisions on it.
Canadians seem to feel that human rights are intrinsic to being human, but gay people are the exception. It took an act of Parliament to have us receive the same legal treatment as straight people. In the early 70s, I joined a Roman Catholic group for gay people, and that group got kicked out of the Catholic Church because it believed that there was no problem with same-sex and a loving consensual relationship. The group was called Dignity, and ever since then the Church has never allowed gay-affirming people to be separately organized within the Church. So I did have a background of feeling discriminated against.
Ron Kidd is a financial auditor in Vancouver. He began advocating for human rights after Dignity left the Catholic Church.
The Catholic Church led the campaign against gay people being included on the Ontario Human Rights Code because we were a threat to family values. And that left me really furious. At the same time, the Catholic Church was having this public persona of supporting family values. The abuse against the Indigenous children was busy going on. And that never came up in the legislature because almost everybody was straight, male, and white.
Years later, in 2007, Kidd was following the story of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. As an auditor, he had a lot of questions about how the agreement was actually being administered. First and foremost, did the church actually pay out the money they were supposed to?
When I learned that the Catholic Church was supposed to pay $54 million in cash, my background as an auditor came out, and I asked, did they actually pay the money? So just because I did not like the Catholic Church, I wrote the Honorable Chuck Strahl if the Catholic Church had actually met its obligation, which was $25 million for fundraising, $29 million in an upfront cash payment, and $25 million in healing services, a total of $79 million. And I wrote Chuck Strahl in 2007, has the church actually paid up? A few months after I began doing this, I did get a reply from the federal government. And that reply was that it was their opinion that the Catholic Church had not met their obligations under the Residential School Settlement Agreement. And it felt like I was the only person in Canada who knew that. And I would estimate that I contacted about 100 newspapers to try to give that as a story. And I only got interest from one newspaper, and that was from Gloria Galloway, who was working for the Globe and Mail at the time. And she contacted the federal government, and the government told her that that it was going to start legal action against the Catholic Church in order to get the obligations met. And she put that on the front page of the Globe and Mail in 2014, and that's how the story got broke out.
Kidd then worked with NDP MP Charlie Angus to write detailed written questions to the government.
That was a real thrill but the government admitted to legal missteps that resulted in the victims being shortchanged $23 million worth of healing services. That was 2016. Charlie Angus raised two questions in the House of Commons on this matter. The replies were not satisfactory for either of them. I feel that one of the questions was really deceitful. It asked how much had been paid to the victims, and the response was the money was never intended to be paid to the victims. It was intended to be paid to the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. Well, the Aboriginal Healing Foundation had folded many years before that reply was given in the House of Commons, and it only got around $14 million. I was asking about $54 million. So just by changing the verb tense, the government didn't answer the question.
I would think they would take that seriously.
It was quite an experience to be in Ottawa when Charlie Angus thanked me, and to hear the opening debate in the House of Commons. Now, of the many lifetime moments I will never forget.
With the government and the church both feeling the heat, things started to happen.
The House of Commons motion asked the church to resume fundraising, and it asked the Catholic Church to release the documents it still has that document its abuse of children. And that was a very generous offer that the federal government has made to the Catholic Church. And the offer is, if the Catholic Church releases its documentation about its abuse of children, those documents will not be used against it or any individual in a legal proceeding.
We want unfettered access to those records. We also want access to our cultural artifacts that are held here in Rome and at the Vatican.
It's all led up to this moment, as survivors and leaders gathered in Rome to meet the Pope at the Vatican.
Those artifacts tell a story about our communities. Those are our history. In reconciliation, we talked about an apology and that acknowledgement. We've heard from our survivors that many of them need that to move forward.
Raymond Frogner is asking for the documents. He's the head archivist at the Center for Truth and Reconciliation, based on the University of Manitoba campus in Winnipeg.
Generally speaking, our mandate is to create an Indigenous-centered and guided center for research into the history and legacy of the residential school system that ran in Canada for over 100 years.
Okay, and there's a lot of activity going on. You recently signed an agreement with the Oblate Order. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. The Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement involved a considerable number of church groups, Protestant and Catholic. Included in those was the Oblates of OMI Lacombe, who were responsible for running 48 of the residential schools across Western Canada. As of last August, we began to have some serious and intense discussions that led to an agreement that we actually just signed last week to recognize that they would like to see the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation become the principal repository for the research, reference, access, and use of records that document the Oblates of OMI Lacombe and their operational and administrative records that documented the residential school system in Canada. And the agreement also states that it will include all the records in the spirit of accountability and transparency.
Are you in a position to tell me if you think the Catholic Church is thawing on their resistance to providing or opening up their archives?
They're beginning to open them up, yes. I would say when this whole process started, back when the URSA was signed, this I don't think was the case. One of the reasons I think this has changed is the recent discovery of the unmarked burial sites of children who attended these schools. I think the highlight and the focus that it brought to the order has convinced them that accountability, transparency, and acknowledgement is the best response to the situation, and we're starting to see more access.
Each residential school had a file called a narrative. The narratives were put into a database so lawyers and adjudicators could compare testimony from students who attended the same school at the same time.
The narratives themselves were brought together under the Department of Legal Affairs and Minister of Justice, and for the resolution of claims, residential school claims. So over time, the Indian Affairs that became CERNA, as well as held these narratives. And not all of them were originally made available to the NCTR. They have been now, and we have the unredacted versions of all of them as of December.
Some researchers have told APTN Investigates they believe the Canadian government attempted to sanitize these narratives.
We want a complete draft of every final version unredacted. That's ultimately our goal, so that they could be made available. But yeah, those researchers are quite right. For some time, there was restrictions on some of the materials that was released.
Many people see the slow response to releasing records as a way of protecting perpetrators. But Frogner says it's not that simple.
Sometimes, I mean, it's hard to know whether they're protecting perpetrators or whether they're limiting the risk of having to go to court themselves over settlements of some kind or another.
So once again, Canada's the referee and they're playing in the game as well.
It's been a bit like that for since 1867, I guess you could say. But I mean, the tone has changed, and we are getting access to an incredible amount of funding and support. We have received now the predominant amount of records, so it has changed. The tone in the relationship is evolving. Things have most definitely changed, especially in the last 2 years.
The Indian Registrar, a status Indian is followed from cradle to grave. If they're not accounted for, it should be pretty obvious. Am I being way too optimistic in saying that the registrar could help to figure out who never came home, and then are they cooperating?
We have had discussions with them, and they've let it be known that we can turn to them to get more information on these issues. Of course, our focus began with the residential schools themselves, and that was the research that the TRC did. But we are branching out into those kinds of resources to build a more comprehensive resource base for these for the residential schools and the experiences that they created.
Are Canadians now realizing there's a problem?
It is, and I mean, that kind of the social memory teaches us that, you know, we are what we choose to remember, but we're also what we choose to forget. And this is an episode of our history that we have chosen to forget for quite some time. And to rehabilitate the relationship between settler society and Indigenous communities will take time and effort. And this kind of acknowledgement is the first step. This kind of education is the first step towards rehabilitating and rebuilding this relationship. And maybe not even rebuilding, but just building it to begin with.